Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Hercule Poirot as he's called to a quiet London street, where a gentleman's top hat lies abandoned at dawn, damp with rain, but curiously spotless inside. No footprints, no struggle, no sound. Yet something about its position feels deliberate. When Poirot lifts the hat, he discovers more than fabric and felt. He finds a secret stitched into its lining, one that leads to a crime committed in silence and elegance. Stay with me till the end, because the man who lost his hat may never have existed at all. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second, until the very end. Chapter 1. The Hook. The inciting incident. Grand Hotel stood at the edge of the fashionable district, a beacon of opulence amidst the lavish lights of London. Its towering facade glistened under the twilight sky, beckoning the city's elite to indulge in its exclusive luxuries. Inside, a quiet hum of sophisticated chatter echoed from the chandeliers as guests sipped on their cocktail. The air fragrant with the scent of rich cigars and delicate perfumes. The evening was young, and the promise of luxury was thick in the atmosphere until it was shattered. In the middle of a private, invitation-only event held in the hotel's most elegant ballroom, the sudden scream of a woman froze the crowd. The guests' heads turned toward the source, a lavishly dressed woman, her face pale with horror. Pointing toward the grand entrance, there, lying crumpled on the marble floor, was the body of Sir Alistair Carrington, one of the most influential figures in British industry. His once immaculately tailored suit stained dark with blood. The murder of Sir Alistair was not just a loss to his family or the business world, it was a scandal. He had been at the center of countless business dealings, not all of them legitimate, and he had made enemies in both high and low circles. His death, especially in such a public fashion, threatened to expose the darker side of the city's elite. The scene was chaotic. The guests, still frozen in shock, gathered around the lifeless body, some whispering nervously, others utterly speechless. A few brave souls attempted to offer aid, but it was clear from the position of Sir Alistair's body, his hands stretched toward an abandoned top hat that he had already passed. A quick assessment of the scene confirmed that nothing had been stolen. No valuable items had been taken, and there was no sign of a struggle. The only unusual detail was the discarded top hat, left carelessly by his side, as though it had been thrown aside in the middle of a desperate moment. The hotel staff quickly sealed off the area, and within moments, Scotland Yard had arrived. But it was clear that the situation demanded more than just a police investigation. It required the keen mind of Hercule Poirot. As the crowd continued to murmur in disbelief, the familiar, meticulous figure of Poirot entered the room. His pristine suit, immaculately pressed, and the glint in his eyes betrayed his usual self-assuredness. His presence in the hotel was not an accident. The Belgian detective had been invited to the party by an old acquaintance, Mrs. Amelia Ward, a prominent socialite with a taste for intrigue. Poirot's eyes flicked over the scene, quickly taking in every detail. The manner in which the guests were behaving, nervous glances, overly calm gestures, and forced smiles all gave away a great deal. But it wasn't just their faces that told the story. It was their bodies, their movements, the things they tried to hide. Without speaking a word, Poirot walked to the body, kneeling briefly beside Sir Alistair. He made a subtle gesture to one of the constables who had begun to examine the crime scene. "I have heard of this man, but I must admit, I did not know him well," Poirot said, his voice calm and measured as he stood. "But already, I see much more than you, my friend." The constable gave him a puzzled glance, but Poirot didn't seem to mind. He turned to the woman who had first screamed, Mrs. Vera Hastings, the wife of one of Sir Alistair's business rivals. The woman's distress was palpable, but there was something oddly mechanical about her demeanor. Poirot's sharp gaze caught the faint trembling in her hand as she clutched her shawl. "My lady," Poirot said gently, "I am sure you have been shaken by this tragedy, but I must ask you to stay composed. Can you tell me if you saw anything unusual before the incident?" Mrs. Hastings hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling. "And no, Monsieur Poirot, I was merely speaking with Sir Alistair, and then I heard a noise," and she faltered, her eyes glancing nervously toward the other guests. Poirot's eyes narrowed. There was something about her words that didn't quite fit with the rest of the scene. Her hesitations, her avoidance of eye contact, it was as if she were hiding something more than mere shock. "I see," Poirot said softly. "I shall speak with you again, Mrs. Hastings, but for now, allow me to speak to the others. I have no doubt that each of them has something to reveal whether they know it or not." As Poirot moved through the crowd, his sharp eyes picked out the small discrepancies in each of the suspects' behaviors. The nervous glances exchanged between Lady Margaret Wilkins, Sir Alistair's ex-fiancée, and Richard Devereux, his business partner. The tight smiles from the young Lord Edward Hartley, who had been overheard arguing with Sir Alistair just the day before. Poirot could already see the intricate web of lies, motives, and fears weaving its way through this tangled group. But the most curious element was the discarded top hat. Why had Sir Alistair tossed it aside in such a frantic manner? Was it a symbol of his position, something left behind in a hurry, as though he had been taken by surprise? Or was it a clue, an intentional part of the riddle? Poirot would soon discover that the answers to these questions were far more complex than anyone had anticipated. This was no ordinary murder. It was the beginning of a much larger puzzle, one that only the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot could hope to solve. Chapter 2. The first closed ballroom had quieted, but the unease in the air was palpable. The constables, who had been hastily assigned to guard the scene, exchanged furtive glances as Poirot stood, observing. The grand chandelier above cast long shadows on the marble floor, and beneath it, the body of Sir Alistair Carrington lay still, almost too still. Poirot's gaze drifted over the scene with practiced precision, noting the smallest of details: the discarded top hat, the faint traces of blood staining the edges of Sir Alistair's coat, the way his hand was frozen mid-reach, as though attempting to grab something, perhaps to ward off an attack, or perhaps to clutch an object of some importance. "Examine the body more closely, my friends," Poirot instructed the constables, his voice soft but authoritative. He then turned his attention to the guests who had remained frozen in their places, as though unwilling to move lest they disturb the tragic tableau. Lady Margaret Wilkins, Sir Alistair's ex-fiancée, stood near the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but it was her poised demeanor that caught Poirot's attention. The rigidity of her posture was uncharacteristic of someone experiencing such a tragedy. He would have to speak with her soon. Meanwhile, Richard Devereux, Sir Alistair's business partner, was attempting to hide the agitation that flitted across his face. He had been standing near the body when the discovery was made, but his sudden movements now suggested he was attempting to mask his own nervousness. Poirot's mind immediately began to process the possibilities: an alibi conflict, an affair gone wrong, perhaps both. Poirot moved toward the body, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The pool of blood beneath Sir Alistair was now beginning to dry, but there was something odd about the position of the wound. It wasn't the kind of fatal blow one would expect in a violent confrontation. There was no sign of a struggle, and yet the nature of the wound spoke volumes. An elegant, almost clinical cut. His eyes narrowed in thought. Poirot knelt beside Sir Alistair's body, his fingertips brushing the fabric of his coat, seeking any clue that might have been overlooked by the less observant. His gaze fell upon the left breast pocket, which had been neatly slashed open carefully, as if with deliberate intent. The contents, a gold pocket watch and a folded letter, were missing. Ah! Poirot muttered under his breath, rising from his crouch. The watch and the letter. What secrets were they keeping? We must find them. He moved away from the body, taking in the full breadth of the ballroom once more. It was then that he saw the subtle reaction from one of the guests, a young man, Lord Edward Hartley, who had been unusually still during the initial flurry of excitement. He had been standing by the door when the body was discovered, his eyes lingering on the floor before darting away at the moment Poirot glanced in his direction. Poirot made a mental note. There was something about the way Lord Hartley avoided his gaze that spoke volumes. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something deeper. Poirot then turned his attention to the surrounding table, on which a silver tray laden with drinks remained untouched. His eyes narrowed at the crystal glass closest to the tray, its contents shimmering in the dim light. There was a faint discoloration in the liquid, a dark red hue. Poirot leaned forward, examining it closely, and then turned to the constables. "Take that glass and examine it carefully," Poirot instructed. "It may be nothing, but we must be thorough. It could be poisoned or it could be an innocent drink, but for now, we can't rule it out." As the constable retrieved the glass, Poirot's gaze shifted once more to the guests, particularly Mrs. Vera Hastings, the first to scream when the body was discovered. She stood now near the center of the room, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she gripped her shawl. Her eyes darted nervously between the others, never settling on any one person for too long. Poirot approached her, the weight of his attention making her fidget uncomfortably. "Madam," he began, his voice soft but penetrating, "you were the first to raise alarm when you saw Sir Alister's body. Tell me, what did you see? Did you notice anything unusual before his fall?" Mrs. Hastings took a sharp breath, her fingers pressing tighter into her shawl. "I don't know. I only saw Sir Alister, and then I screamed. I was standing near the window, talking with Lady Wilkins. I didn't see anything else." She hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. "But there was a man, someone near the door, he seemed hurried." Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. A man near the door? Could it have been Lord Edward Hartley? "And this man, could you describe him?" Poirot asked, his gaze never leaving hers. "I didn't see much. Just a silhouette in the doorway," Mrs. Hastings replied, her eyes darting nervously. "But I'm sure I heard footsteps before I saw the body." Poirot gave a slight nod, his mind already processing the fragments of information. It wasn't much, but it was something. A hurried figure in the doorway, the discarded top hat, the missing pocket watch, each detail seemed to add a layer of mystery. But none of it pointed directly to the killer. He turned back to the constables, who had now taken the glass away for testing. "We must be patient, my friends," Poirot said, his voice calm. "The pieces are scattered, but they will come together in time. It is only a matter of following the right path." Poirot then allowed his gaze to settle once more on the gathered guests. The tension in the room was growing palpable, but Poirot knew one thing for certain before the evening ended. He would have the answers. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. The investigation was taking shape, though the mysteries only seemed to deepen with each passing moment. Hercule Poirot stood at the heart of the ballroom, his eyes calculating, his mind already piecing together a portrait of each suspect. The guests, though still startled, had begun to settle, their expressions betraying the anxiety that hung in the air. They all knew that the murder of Sir Alister Carrington was no ordinary crime, and Poirot's presence only added to the sense of foreboding. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the room as Poirot gave a brief signal to the constables, who began ushering the guests toward a more private area of the hotel. Lady Margaret Wilkins, her face still pale, was the first to step forward. She approached Poirot with a tight-lipped smile, but her movements were stiff and uncomfortable. Sir Alistair was a difficult man, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But he was, I suppose, a man of his time, impatient, always moving forward, never looking back. Poirot gave her a quick, assessing glance. Her voice trembled slightly, a trace of distress that she was trying, and failing, to conceal. Still, there was something else in her demeanor, something subtle. Perhaps a hint of guilt in the way she avoided meeting his eyes for too long. A fleeting sense of discomfort hovered over her as though she were wrestling with a memory. Too painful to confront. And you, madam, Poirot began, his words smooth but with an edge of quiet authority, were once very close to Sir Alistair, yes? A lover, a confidant. Lady Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and her gaze flickered toward the floor before she answered. Yes, but that was a long time ago. Before he changed. People change, don't they? His business dealings. Well, they left much to be desired. Her words, casual yet weighted with an undertone of bitterness, sparked Poirot's interest. There was much she was not saying, but for now, he decided not to press her further. Instead, his eyes moved to the next guest in the line, Richard Devereux. Devereux stood rigidly at the edge of the group, his tall, broad frame seemingly out of place in such a setting of polished elegance. His face, though solemn, carried an air of disquiet. The sharp lines of his jaw were clenched, his hands tucked into the pockets of his trousers, almost as if he were trying to hide something or perhaps trying to restrain himself from doing something he might regret. Mr. Devereux, Poirot addressed him with a polite nod. I believe you and Sir Alistair were quite close, yes? Business partners, I understand? Devereux gave a curt nod, but his eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact. Yes, we were. We had many dealings together, though. I would not say we were close. Sir Alistair was difficult to understand, at times. The tone of Devereux's voice left little room for doubt. His words were measured, but there was a strained edge to them, as though he were hiding something. Poirot observed the man carefully, noting the subtle nervousness in his mannerisms, the way his fingers briefly twitched, as if reaching for something. I see, Poirot said softly. And your relationship with Sir Alistair, was it always so strained? Devereux hesitated for a moment longer than necessary, and Poirot's eyes narrowed. There were disagreements. Business, mostly. Sir Alistair was not a man who took criticism well. Poirot's mind catalogued the response. Disagreements, unresolved tension, but no direct admission of conflict that could lead to murder. Yet, Poirot's attention then shifted to Mrs. Vera Hastings, who stood slightly apart from the others. Her figure was poised, though her eyes were still darting nervously about the room. She had been the first to raise the alarm, and there was a certain anxiety about her that suggested more than just shock. Poirot made his way toward her, his steps deliberate and measured. Mrs. Hastings, he began, you were quite distressed when the body was discovered. It is natural, of course. But I must ask you, what did you see? What happened immediately before the discovery? Mrs. Hastings visibly stiffened at the mention of the moment of discovery. She looked away quickly, as if she hadn't quite prepared herself to relive the event. I already told the constables, she said, her voice edged with a touch of impatience. I was near the window, speaking with Lady Wilkins. I didn't see anything unusual, but I did hear someone running, and then the scream. A scream, you say? Poirot asked, his gaze sharpening. A scream that came from whom, exactly? Mrs. Hastings shifted uncomfortably, the edges of her fingers trembling. I don't know. It was just a scream. And then I turned, and Sir Alistair was on the floor. Poirot paused, considering her words. Her statement was vague, the kind of evasion he had already begun to notice in others. But Poirot was patient. The truth, he knew, was often wrapped in layers of half-truths. "Very well," Poirot murmured, before turning his attention to Lord Edward Hartley. The young man had been standing by the door, nervously adjusting his cufflinks as he caught Poirot's eye. There was something strange about the way Lord Hartley avoided direct contact, as if he feared what Poirot might see in him. "Lord Hartley," Poirot said, inclining his head slightly in greeting. "You were nearby when the body was discovered, yes?" Lord Hartley stiffened, his posture rigid as he cleared his throat. "Yes, I was by the door." His words faltered for a brief moment, and Poirot caught the fleeting hesitation. "I heard the scream, and when I came in, well, I saw it all." The young man's face was flushed with tension, his eyes darting nervously to the other guests. His response was more guarded than the others, and Poirot's keen instincts told him that Lord Hartley was hiding something, a secret, perhaps, or a deeper knowledge of the event. "Perhaps you could tell me more about what you saw," Poirot suggested, his tone soft but pressing. Lord Hartley hesitated for a moment too long, and Poirot immediately took note of it. "I saw Mrs. Hastings standing near the window," Lord Hartley began, his voice wavering slightly. "And then I saw Sir Alistair lying on the floor." Poirot studied the young man's face closely. There was fear in his eyes, but also something else, an unease that suggested more than mere shock. Poirot's lips tightened ever so slightly. Lord Hartley's reaction was unnatural. "Thank you, Lord Hartley," Poirot said quietly. "That will be all for now," as the guests gathered into the corners of the room. Poirot's mind was already racing. There were pieces to this puzzle, clues hidden in the most unlikely of places. A discarded top hat, a missing pocket watch, nervous glances, half-truths, and unexplained behavior. The game had begun, and Poirot was certain of one thing: the truth was buried deep within these people, and it was only a matter of time before he unearthed it. Chapter 4. Poirot Arrives's guests stood scattered around the edges of the grand ballroom. The tension thick in the air. Each one had been interviewed, their statements recorded by the constables, but there was still no clear picture of what had transpired. Hercule Poirot had studied each of them carefully, each nervous twitch, each carefully masked glance gathering impressions. As he meticulously worked through the puzzle in his mind, as the evening wore on, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive, and the soft clinking of glasses and whispered conversations did little to dispel the unease. The constables, though competent, were out of their depth. The investigation had begun, but it had stalled. There was no breakthrough, no solid lead to chase. Poirot, however, had no intention of allowing the case to languish. With a sharp nod, he indicated to the constables to gather the suspects once again. They were to be assembled in the drawing room for a more formal questioning, where he would perform his own observations, unsullied by any preconceived theories. It was time to do things his way, time to begin unraveling the web of deception that had already started to take form. With the guests slowly filing into the drawing room, Poirot observed them silently as one by one they settled into their respective seats. Lady Margaret Wilkins was the first to arrive, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes focused on the floor. She was visibly shaken, though whether by grief or guilt, Poirot could not yet tell. Richard Devereux followed, walking with the measured pace of a man trying to appear unaffected. But Poirot noted the brief falter in his step when his eyes met Poirot's. He was hiding something. Poirot was certain of it. Mrs. Vera Hastings entered next, her demeanor slightly more composed than before, but the faint tremble in her voice when she greeted Poirot betrayed her nerves. She had something to hide, something she was not yet willing to reveal. Poirot had already made a mental note of her body language, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the way her fingers occasionally fidgeted at the edge of her shawl. Lord Edward Hartley was the last to enter, and Poirot could see that the young man was still rattled. His eyes darted nervously about the room, and he seemed to hesitate for a moment as if considering a hasty exit. Poirot gave him a soft, reassuring smile, but Hartley did not return the gesture. Instead, he lowered his gaze, clearly uncomfortable under the detective's scrutiny. Once everyone had gathered, Poirot took a moment to observe each suspect, mentally cataloging every gesture, every shift in posture, every flicker of emotion on their faces. He had already formed a number of conclusions, but it was too soon to draw them out. The time for quiet analysis was over. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made the room fall silent. "I must insist that you listen carefully, for I have much to say and much to ask." He paced slowly in front of them, his steps measured and precise. "A man has died tonight, and while many of you appear distressed, I see something else in your eyes. I see uncertainty, yes, but I also see concealment. And this concealment, this is where I shall begin." Poirot paused and fixed his gaze on Lady Margaret Wilkins. "Madam," he said softly, his voice gentle yet insistent, "you were once a close companion of Sir Alistair Carrington, yes? But you claim to have had little connection to him in recent years. It is curious. You did not appear overly distressed upon discovering his body. Instead, you seem removed. Why is that?" Lady Margaret's eyes widened slightly, and she stiffened in her chair. "I don't understand what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. I was shocked, of course. Sir Alistair's death was sudden, tragic, but I've had time to come to terms with it. We had no great relationship at the end." Poirot nodded, taking in her words, but offering no immediate reply. Instead, he turned his attention to Richard Devereux, whose composure was beginning to crack. "Mr. Devereux," Poirot continued, his voice now laced with subtle emphasis, "you were Sir Alistair's business partner, yet you seem, how do you say, on edge. The tension in your shoulders, the nervousness in your eyes. What is it you are hiding, Mr. Devereux?" Devereux shifted in his chair, his hands tightening into fists before he relaxed them with visible effort. "I am not hiding anything, Poirot. I am simply trying to make sense of what happened. Sir Alistair's death. It sits impossible to grasp. How could this happen?" Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "Impossible? Ah, Mr. Devereux, nothing is truly impossible. There's always an explanation, though perhaps one that you would prefer not to reveal." Devereux's lips pressed into a thin line, but he remained silent. Poirot's gaze flickered briefly to Lord Edward Hartley. "Ah, Lord Hartley," Poirot said, his tone shifting. "You were standing near the door when the body was found. You saw the body before anyone else, yes? But you have been strangely reluctant to offer details." Why? Hartley flinched, his eyes wide with discomfort. I didn't see anything, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't want to get involved. I was just standing there. There was no need to make a scene." Poirot leaned in slightly, his voice calm but insistent. "You say you saw nothing, but your behavior suggests otherwise. What are you not telling me, Lord Hartley?" Hartley visibly tensed. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but closed it just as quickly, his eyes darting to the others in the room. For a brief moment, Poirot caught a glimpse of the young man's fear that could not be easily masked. "Madam Hastings," Poirot said, turning his attention back to the woman, "you were the first to raise the alarm, but you have not given a full account of your movements. You mentioned hearing running footsteps before discovering the body. But who was running? Mrs. Hastings, who?" Mrs. Hastings hesitated, her lips trembling slightly before she responded. I don't know. I didn't see anyone." "It could have been anyone, really." Poirot tilted his head, his gaze never leaving her face. "You did not see anyone? Or you simply choose not to tell me?" The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. Each suspect shifted uncomfortably, their nerves fraying beneath the detective's watchful eye. The psychological game was beginning, and Poirot knew that soon enough, one of them would slip. But for now, he waited, his mind calculating every possible angle, every word, every action. The truth was within reach, hidden somewhere beneath the layers of deception, waiting to be uncovered, and Poirot was ready to find it. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. Tension in the room had reached a palpable level, the weight of unanswered questions hanging heavily in the air. Poirot's gaze moved from one suspect to the next, each of them holding something back, but not yet willing to fully reveal what it was. The detective, however, had long since learned that the truth, while often hidden, was never beyond reach. It was time to begin the first round of formal questioning. Poirot stepped forward, his gaze lingering on the group, and then he turned to Mrs. Vera Hastings, who was still clutching her shawl, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Her nervousness had not gone unnoticed, and Poirot was sure she knew more than she was letting on. "Madam Hastings," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "I must begin with you. You were the first to scream when Sir Alistair was discovered dead, and yet, I find your response somewhat curious. You appear not as shaken as one would expect." Mrs. Hastings straightened, her eyes widening as though caught off guard by the detective's directness. "I don't understand. I was shocked, of course, but there was nothing I could do. Sir Alistair was gone," and Poirot raised a hand to stop her, his expression unchanging. "I do not question your reaction, Madam Hastings, but I wonder, did you know Sir Alistair well enough to expect his death, or was it a complete surprise to you?" The question was not a direct accusation, but it hit its mark nonetheless. Mrs. Hastings looked down at her hands, as though seeking strength in them. Before lifting her gaze back to Poirot, she paused before speaking. I knew him," she said softly. "Not well, but I knew him. We had our differences, yes. He wasn't easy to get along with." Poirot studied her for a moment longer before moving on, sensing that there was more hidden beneath her words. "Thank you, Madam Hastings. Your testimony will be invaluable." Next, Poirot turned his attention to Richard Devereux, who was sitting across the room, his posture stiff, his face a mask of controlled calm. But Poirot could see the tightness around his jaw, the slight fidgeting of his fingers, small signs of someone trying to conceal their discomfort. "Mr. Devereux," Poirot began, his tone deliberate, "I must ask you about your relationship with Sir Alistair. You have both worked together for some time, yes?" Devereux nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he met Poirot's gaze. "Yes, we worked together. We were business partners. And how would you describe your partnership?" Poirot pressed, his voice casual but probing. Devereux's lips pressed into a thin line. "It was professional. Nothing more." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Nothing more. No personal connections? No emotional ties?" Devereux hesitated, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of something that could be guilt, or perhaps fear. The moment passed quickly, but Poirot had caught it. "I did not have an emotional connection with Sir Alistair," Devereux said firmly, though his voice betrayed the faintest hint of defensiveness. "He was a difficult man to like, but he was a man of great influence, and we worked well together." Poirot's gaze never left Devereux's face. He was lying, that much was clear, but for now, Poirot had no evidence to prove it, only the faintest inkling that the truth was buried somewhere deeper, beneath the layers of professional distance Devereux had erected. "Very well. Mr. Devereux," Poirot said smoothly, "but I must ask, where were you when Sir Alistair was found? What were you doing?" Devereux's eyes flickered briefly toward the others before he answered, a little too quickly. "I was in my room, preparing for the event. I didn't see anyone until the scream was heard." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, noting the slight quiver in Devereux's voice. He didn't press further, knowing that the right moment would come. Next, Poirot's gaze turned to Lord Edward Hartley, who had been fidgeting with his cufflinks. his eyes avoiding the detective's gaze. Poirot took a slow step toward the young man, noting the unease that had returned to his features. Hartley had not spoken much, and Poirot intended to change that. "Lord Hartley," Poirot said, his voice gentle but insistent, "you were standing near the door when the body was found. You saw the body before anyone else, yes? But you have been strangely reluctant to offer details. Why?" Hartley froze for a moment, then looked up at Poirot, his face pale. I didn't see anything, Monsieur Poirot. I just heard the scream, and I came inside. I didn't know what had happened." Poirot regarded him for a moment, watching his face closely. There was something wrong with his story, the hesitation, the way he struggled to meet Poirot's eyes. Poirot wasn't convinced, but for now, there was little more to say. "Lord Hartley, I must remind you," Poirot continued, "that this is not a time for hesitation. If you know something, now is the moment to speak." Hartley shifted in his chair, his hands clenching and unclenching. I told you, I didn't see anything. I didn't know what happened." Poirot gave a small nod, then turned his attention to Lady Margaret Wilkins, who had been silent through much of the questioning. Her composure remained largely unbroken, but there was a wariness in her eyes as she met his gaze. "Lady Wilkins," Poirot began, his tone softer but no less penetrating, "you were once very close to Sir Alistair. What happened between you two? Why did you part ways?" Lady Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. We had differences. Sir Alistair was a man with many faults, and I could no longer be part of his world. It was as simple as that." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "I see, but you were close once. And now, here you are, in the midst of this tragedy. Tell me, Lady Wilkins, where were you when Sir Alistair was found?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the other suspects before she answered, her voice steady. "I was with Mrs. Hastings by the window. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Nothing unusual happened." Poirot nodded slowly, but inside, his mind was working overtime. Her words didn't quite match her actions, and Poirot suspected there was far more to her story than she was letting on. Each interview had brought more questions than answers, and Poirot knew the pieces were still not fitting together. But one thing was clear: someone in this room was lying, and Poirot was determined to uncover who that person was, no matter how long it took. Chapter 6. First false led. First round of interviews had not provided any definitive answers, but Poirot knew that was often the case at the beginning of a complex investigation. The threads were all there, but none of them were yet ready to be pulled. As he watched the suspects file out of the drawing room, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The puzzle pieces were starting to form, but there were still many gaps to be filled. The constables had been busy taking notes, but Poirot's mind was already working on the subtle inconsistencies in the testimonies. There were contradictions, slight evasions, but nothing that pointed definitively to the killer. However, there was something else in the air now, an overwhelming sense that the case was veering dangerously close to a false lead, and Poirot could almost sense it. The guests were to remain in the hotel for the time being, and Poirot was determined to keep them all in one place. As he stepped out of the room and into the grand hallway, he signaled to the constables, motioning for them to gather the suspects once more. This time, however, it wasn't just a matter of asking questions. Poirot had a feeling he needed to test them, to provoke reactions that would reveal hidden truths. It was nearing dusk, and the soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the large windows of the hotel's grand salon. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his sharp eyes surveying the group of suspects. As they all gathered once more, there was a sense of uneasy anticipation in the air. "Madam Wilkins," Poirot began, his voice even and steady, "I have been thinking of something you said earlier. You mentioned that Sir Alistair had many faults, but what I am curious about is the nature of these faults. You seem to imply there was something more personal in nature. Lady Wilkins stiffened, her expression tightening. I did not mean to suggest anything untoward, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Alistair and I simply. We had differences. He was a difficult man, as I have already said. He was obsessed with power, and his business dealings were often morally questionable. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on her. There was something about her delivery, the hesitation in her voice, that raised Poirot's suspicions. Morally questionable. Poirot repeated, his tone gentle but probing. Tell me, Lady Wilkins, did Sir Alistair have any personal enemies, or was it only business adversaries? Lady Wilkins' lips pressed into a thin line. His business affairs were contentious, as I have said. But as for personal enemies, perhaps there were a few, though I do not know who would wish him harm. Poirot nodded slowly, but inwardly he was unconvinced. Her reluctance to provide a straightforward answer seemed more revealing than the words she had spoken. Thank you, Lady Wilkins, Poirot said, allowing her to leave the center of the room. That will be all for now. Next, Poirot's gaze turned toward Richard Devereux, who had been standing with his arms crossed, observing the others with a stony expression. Poirot had not forgotten the way Devereux had seemed overly defensive. During the first round of questioning, Mr. Devereux, Poirot called, his voice firm. You mentioned earlier that you were in your room when the murder occurred, but I find your timing curious. Were you alone in your room, or were you perhaps with someone? Devereux's eyes flickered for a moment before he quickly regained his composure. I was alone, Monsieur Poirot. I told you that already. Poirot's expression remained unchanged. But you didn't mention whether you had heard anything unusual before the scream. Any sounds that might have been out of place? Devereux shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. I did not hear anything. I was preparing for the event. I was before Devereux could finish. A commotion broke out at the far side of the room. Lord Hartley, who had been standing near the door, suddenly rushed forward. His face pale. It's impossible, he exclaimed, his voice trembling with disbelief. There's been another crime. Another murder. The room went silent as all eyes turned to Lord Hartley. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Poirot's mind immediately snapped into focus. Another crime? Was this truly the work of the same person who had killed Sir Alistair? Poirot quickly moved toward Lord Hartley, his every step measured and precise. What do you mean, Lord Hartley? Another murder? Hartley seemed to struggle for words, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I found something in the hallway. A letter. It was addressed to Sir Alistair. But it was covered in blood. And there's more. Something inside the letter. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. A letter? This was the first concrete clue to emerge since the crime had been discovered. It was certainly possible that Sir Alistair had been involved in something dangerous. But what was this letter? Who could have written it? And why was it covered in blood? Where is this letter now? Poirot asked quickly, his eyes never leaving Lord Hartley. It's in my room, Lord Hartley stammered. I was going to show it to you, but I wasn't sure if I should. It's all too much. Poirot gave a sharp nod. We will look at it immediately. Everyone stay here, he added, his tone brokering no disagreement. No one is to leave. The group reluctantly settled back into their positions, the air thick with anticipation. Poirot could feel the puzzle shifting, the pieces beginning to align. But this new revelation had introduced even more uncertainty. What did the letter contain? And could it provide the breakthrough Poirot had been waiting for? As Poirot followed Lord Hartley to his room, he couldn't help but wonder if this letter was just another false lead, or if it would finally reveal the truth behind Sir Alistair's murder. The next few moments would be crucial, and Poirot was determined to uncover whatever secret lay hidden within that blood-stained paper. Chapter 7. The psychological Gammoth hallway was dimly lit. the flickering candlelight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Along the polished floor, Lord Edward Hartley led Poirot down the corridor, his steps hurried, but still cautious. The air between them was thick with tension, and Poirot could sense the young man's unease. Every now and then, Hartley would glance back over his shoulder, his brow furrowing as if expecting something or someone unexpected. When they reached the door to Hartley's room, he hesitated before unlocking it. Poirot noticed the slight trembling of his hand as he turned the key. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. Lord Hartley motioned to the writing desk where a small envelope sat, partially opened, its contents still visible inside. Poirot approached it slowly, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. The room was neatly kept, though the tension in the air had clearly affected Hartley's ability to remain composed. Poirot carefully picked up the letter and observed the stains on the paper. The blood had dried into a dark, jagged pattern that marred the otherwise immaculate script. He opened it further, noting the lack of any visible markings that could give away its sender. The letter appeared to have been hastily written, with words scrawled in a rushed, almost frantic hand. "Who found this letter, Lord Hartley?" Poirot asked, his voice steady and deliberate. He turned the letter over, examining the back. "I did, Monsieur Poirot. I was looking for some papers when I came across it in the corner of the room. I thought it might have been important, but—" Hartley trailed off, clearly struggling to explain himself. Poirot's eyes never left the letter. "But what, Lord Hartley? What did you think when you saw the blood?" "I don't know," Hartley muttered, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought perhaps it had something to do with Sir Alistair's death, but I didn't want to make any assumptions, so I kept it to myself." Poirot studied the letter more closely, but he didn't press Hartley further for the moment. His instincts told him that the young man was withholding something, but whether it was related to the letter or something else was still unclear. After a few moments, Poirot set the letter down on the desk, his mind racing. The bloodstains had been applied after the letter had been sealed, as if it had been discarded and carelessly left behind. What did this suggest? A struggle, a desperate attempt to hide something, or was it merely a dramatic flourish intended to confuse? "I must say, Lord Hartley, that this letter raises many questions," Poirot finally said, his voice cool but laced with underlying curiosity. "Tell me, where did you find this letter? Was it in plain sight, or was it hidden?" Hartley's gaze dropped to the floor. "It was on the floor, near the corner of the room. I didn't notice it at first, but then I saw the bloodstain and thought I should look at it more closely." Poirot nodded, making a mental note of Hartley's words. "Very well, Lord Hartley. You have done well to bring this to my attention. I shall now keep this letter in my possession for further examination." As Poirot turned to leave the room, his mind remained focused on the situation. The blood on the letter had undoubtedly been a deliberate act, but what was the intention behind it? Why had the letter been left behind? And more importantly, what did it reveal about the relationship between Sir Alistair and the others in this room? As Poirot closed the door behind him, he turned to Hartley. "I will need to speak to the others again, Lord Hartley. You must remain in your room, but do not leave it for any reason. I may need you to confirm some details later." Hartley nodded, still pale, and moved to sit on the edge of his bed. He was shaken, that much was clear, but Poirot couldn't help but notice the sense of guilt that lingered in his eyes. There was something he wasn't telling, and Poirot was certain that this new clue, this letter, was the key to unraveling the mystery. Poirot returned to the drawing room, where the remaining guests were waiting. Their faces were anxious, each of them looking as though they were anticipating their turn under Poirot's watchful eye. The game was about to change. Now that he had seen the letter, he could feel the threads tightening, the pressure building. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot said, his voice calm and measured, I must ask you to remain seated. I believe the next phase of this investigation will yield the answers we seek." He moved slowly across the room, his eyes flicking briefly to each of the guests as he made his way to the center. His mind was calculating, his thoughts sharp and precise. The letter was not the answer in itself, but it was a clue and indication that someone had acted quickly, perhaps out of fear, perhaps in an effort to cover their tracks. "I have seen the letter," Poirot continued, his eyes sweeping over the group. "It was found in Lord Hartley's room, blood-stained and hastily discarded. It suggests something more than a mere accident. Someone is trying to hide something." There was a collective intake of breath from the group, and Poirot could see the fear flicker in their eyes. They had all heard him, understood the weight of his words. They knew that they were being pushed closer to the truth, and yet they each held something back. Poirot paused, allowing the silence to settle in. He could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The pressure was mounting, but no one dared speak. It was the perfect time to press them further. "The game has changed," Poirot said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Now I shall see who breaks under the pressure." Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The atmosphere in the drawing room grew heavier. As Poirot's words hung in the air, the guests, already on edge, seemed to shrink under the pressure of his scrutiny. It was clear that Poirot's revelations had rattled them. The letter had raised the stakes in a way that no one had expected. Now, everyone seemed to be waiting for the next move. Each suspect's face a mask of quiet apprehension. Poirot, however, was not one to let the tension overwhelm him. He had learned long ago to use it to his advantage. With a careful, deliberate step, he moved across the room, his sharp eyes glancing over the group. The letter had certainly opened a new path in the investigation, but Poirot knew better than to rush into any conclusions. The most pressing task now was to observe, to wait. Lady Margaret Wilkins, still seated at one of the armchairs, had not spoken since the letter had been mentioned. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes occasionally flicked toward the others. But her silence was not one of contemplation. Poirot could see it now. She was watching for the others' reactions, as if trying to gauge who might break under the weight of Poirot's revelations. Richard Devereux, on the other hand, was unusually still. He hadn't shown any signs of nervousness since the mention of the blood-stained letter, but Poirot noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders. His posture was too rigid, the kind of physical control someone would employ when hiding something. Mrs. Hastings seemed particularly distraught. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast as she clasped her hands tightly together in her lap. The emotional weight of the situation appeared to have settled in on her more than the others. Yet Poirot wasn't sure if her distress was genuine or part of an act. Lord Hartley, after his earlier outburst, had retreated into a far corner, his hands gripping the edge of a chair as though trying to ground himself. His face was drawn, eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, soft footsteps approaching the door. One of the constables, his face flushed with urgency, entered the room. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," the constable said, his voice shaking slightly. "There's been another incident. A secondary crime, as it seems. We found something in the hallway." Poirot's eyes sharpened, his heart quickening with interest. "A secondary crime? Has someone attempted to cover their tracks again? Or was there something deeper at play?" "Tell me more, Constable," Poirot said, his voice low and calm, a sharp contrast to the constable's evident distress. We found a body, sir," the constable continued, his words hurried. "A woman. She's been poisoned." The room seemed to freeze. A collective gasp rose from the gathered suspects. Poison? Another murder? This was beyond what Poirot had anticipated, but it confirmed his suspicions. The first murder, Sir Alistair's death, had not been an isolated incident. There was something larger at play, something that connected the victims, something that Poirot needed to unravel. Poirot didn't waste a moment. He turned on his heel and gestured for the constable to lead the way. "Show me. Let us see what you've discovered." The constable led him out of the room, and the others followed suit, not knowing whether they were meant to stay or accompany the investigation. Poirot didn't care for the presence of the guests. His mind was already focused on the new development. This wasn't just about Sir Alistair anymore. Someone else had died, and it seemed to be connected to the same web of deceit. As Poirot entered the hallway, the heavy scent of something sharp, something chemical, reached his nostrils. The constable, now standing by the doorway, pointed to a small figure lying on the floor. It was a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress. Her face was pale, almost ashen, her eyes wide open as though frozen in shock. Poirot knelt beside the body, inspecting it with practiced precision. The woman's lips had a faint blue tint, and there was a small vial, now shattered, lying near her outstretched hand. A liquid had pooled beneath her, dark and ominous. It was unmistakable poison. "Do you know who she is?" Poirot asked, his eyes moving quickly over the body. The constable nodded. "Her name is Miss Eleanor Brixton. She was a guest here and acquaintance of Sir Alistair's. I don't know much else, but it seems she was not well liked among the other guests." Poirot stood up, his mind already racing. The name Brixton was unfamiliar, but the poison was not. It was a substance used only by a few people, those with access to rare toxins and knowledge of the effects. Whoever had administered it had done so with care. Knowing exactly how much to use, Poirot turned back to the group of suspects, who had now gathered at the door, their faces a mix of horror and confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the tension, "it seems we have another tragedy on our hands. Miss Brixton's death was no accident. She was poisoned." The room seemed to react as one shock, confusion, and fear flashing across each of their faces. But Poirot had seen this before. They were all hiding something. It was no coincidence that the second victim had died, and Poirot was certain that this death, like the first, was connected to the secrets that each of them held. This murder, like the first, is not an isolated event. Poirot continued, "Someone in this room is guilty of 2 crimes now. It is only a matter of time before the truth is revealed. We must proceed with great care." Poirot turned his attention to the suspects. They had no idea yet how close they were to the truth, but he would guide them slowly, methodically, until the veil of deception was lifted. The investigation was far from over, and the game had just become far more dangerous. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The atmosphere in the hotel had grown suffocating, as if the very walls themselves were closing in on the gathered guests. The murder of Miss Eleanor Brixton had sent shockwaves through the room, leaving the suspects wide-eyed and trembling, unsure of what to say next. Poirot stood at the center of the group, his mind working quickly, analyzing each reaction, each subtle shift in the room's energy. There was more at play here than mere coincidence. 2 murders, the same web of deceit, and the same people tangled within it. The connections were beginning to form, but the puzzle was far from complete. He turned to the constable, who was still standing by the door. "Have you notified the authorities?" Poirot asked, his voice measured. "Yes, sir. They are on their way," the constable replied, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "But we don't know where to begin. It all seems so strange. First Sir Alistair, and now this. Could they be related?" Poirot's gaze flickered to the body of Miss Brixton, still lying motionless on the floor, the poison evident in her veins. The room's oppressive silence pressed in around them. "They are related," Poirot said quietly, "but not in the way you might think." Turning back to the suspects, Poirot could see that the guests were struggling to hide their unease. Lady Margaret Wilkins had stepped back into the corner of the room, Her arms crossed defensively, while Richard Devereux was pacing slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Hastings stood closest to the door, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. Lord Hartley, too, appeared on edge, his gaze flickering toward the body and then quickly away, as though trying to avoid any further involvement in the investigation. Poirot noted his discomfort, and a small, quiet thought began to form in the detective's mind. Lord Hartley was more than just nervous. He was hiding something. Poirot had seen this type of behavior before, someone who tried to remove themselves from the center of attention, yet their discomfort only made them more conspicuous. He would come back to Hartley later. The question we must now answer is simple, yet complicated. Poirot said, his voice calm but firm, pulling the room's attention back to him. Who benefits from Miss Brixton's death? Who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity? Why would anyone want to kill Eleanor? Mrs. Hastings interjected, her voice trembling. She was just an acquaintance of Sir Alistair's. She didn't even. Poirot cut her off gently, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. That, madam, is precisely the question. Why Miss Brixton? Why her, and why now? The more Poirot thought about it, the more the answer became clear. The timing was crucial. Sir Alistair's death had set something in motion, a chain of events, a series of revelations that had yet to be fully uncovered. And Miss Brixton's death, so soon after, was no coincidence. Someone was trying to cover their tracks, to silence the past before it could come to light. Poirot's gaze swept across the group, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. There was someone that had not yet revealed themselves fully. The connections were hidden, lurking beneath layers of lies and false facades. He took a step forward, his voice cool but decisive. Each of you has a connection to Sir Alistair Carrington. Some of you knew him well, some of you did not, but you all knew him in some capacity. And now, with Miss Brixton dead, I believe we are beginning to see the threads of this case unravel. Lady Margaret Wilkins stiffened at his words, her eyes flickering nervously. Devereux stopped pacing, his expression tight as he absorbed Poirot's words. Even Hartley, who had been avoiding eye contact, suddenly met the detective's gaze. Though there was no recognition in his eyes, only confusion, Poirot continued, undeterred. You see, Madam Wilkins, he said, turning to her with a soft smile, you and Miss Brixton were both connected to Sir Alistair in ways you have not yet confessed. I believe you knew her better than you've let on. Perhaps she had something on you? Lady Margaret's lips parted slightly, as though she had been caught off guard. She quickly regained her composure, but Poirot could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I don't know what you mean, she replied stiffly. Miss Brixton was merely a guest, someone who attended the same events as I did. She and Sir Alistair were friends, perhaps, but there was no reason for me to be involved in her death. Perhaps, Poirot said, his voice quiet but filled with purpose. But I suspect there is more to the story than you're telling. Perhaps Miss Brixton knew something about Sir Alistair's dealings, something that could have caused her death. Poirot turned to Richard Devereux, who had been listening intently. And you, Mr. Devereux, he continued, were you involved with Miss Brixton in some way? Perhaps you knew more about her relationship with Sir Alistair than you've shared? Devereux's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he stared at Poirot. I told you, I don't know anything about that woman. She was a nuisance to Sir Alistair's business, nothing more. Poirot's gaze hardened. I do not believe you, Mr. Devereux. I believe you knew more about Miss Brixton than you are letting on. I believe you had a reason to silence her. Devereux's face remained unreadable, but Poirot could sense the undercurrent of fear beneath his calm exterior. There was more to this than a mere business disagreement. Miss Brixton had been a part of something larger, a secret, perhaps, that was now buried with her. Poirot turned back to the group, his expression calm but resolute. "Now, the game is set," he said. "Someone here is lying. And soon, the truth will come out." The room fell silent as Poirot's words hung in the air. Each suspect was now locked in the web of deception, and Poirot could feel the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The evening had deepened into a quiet, unnerving stillness. The guests were all assembled once again in the drawing room, the tension among them growing palpable as they waited for Poirot to speak. The atmosphere was heavy, like a storm gathering on the horizon, and everyone in the room could feel it. The investigation had shifted in the past few hours, from confusion and speculation to something far more ominous. The second murder, Miss Eleanor Brixton's poisoning, had opened new avenues of suspicion and fear. Poirot stood silently in the center of the room, his sharp eyes flicking briefly between the suspects. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. The detective had not yet revealed his next move, but everyone in the room could sense that something significant was coming. "I must thank you all for your patience," Poirot said finally, his voice cutting through the silence. "I have learned much from the interviews today, but there is still one thing that I must share with you, one thing that changes everything." He paused, letting the suspense build. The guests shifted in their seats, their gazes fixed on him. Eager yet anxious, Poirot's eyes rested on Lady Margaret Wilkins first. She was still sitting near the window, her posture stiff but her hands now visibly trembling in her lap. She had been quiet, almost too quiet, since the revelation of Miss Brixton's murder. Poirot had noticed this, and it was why she was the first in his mind to address. Her silence, he suspected, held the key to unraveling the puzzle. "You are a woman of discretion, Lady Wilkins," Poirot said, his voice soft but with an edge. "I believe you have been careful in what you have revealed and what you have concealed, but your manner is telling. You have withheld more than you admit." Lady Margaret's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. She looked down at her hands, her lips pressing tightly together, as if resisting the urge to respond. Poirot turned away from her, his gaze drifting across the room to the others. "But it is not just you, Lady Wilkins. All of you are involved in this case, in ways you cannot yet comprehend. Your secrets, your lies, they have brought us to this point, and each one of you holds a piece of the puzzle." He stopped near the fireplace, turning to face the group once more. His eyes narrowed as he spoke again, this time with more weight in his words. "I have discovered something," Poirot continued, his voice low, "a clue that changes everything. It was right in front of me, hidden in plain sight." The room went deathly still. The guests exchanged wary glances, all wondering what Poirot had discovered. What hidden detail had shifted the course of the investigation earlier? Poirot said, his voice steady. "I examined the scene of Sir Alistair's death. What struck me as odd was the position of his body. There was something unnatural about how he had fallen. But it wasn't until I saw Miss Brixton's body that I understood." The room seemed to tighten. The air felt heavier now, as if everyone was holding their breath. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hastings asked, her voice trembling as she glanced nervously at the others. Poirot glanced at her, his gaze calculating. "I mean that Sir Alistair Carrington's death was not a spontaneous act. It was carefully staged. He did not die immediately upon receiving the blow. No, he had time. Time to do something, to hide something." He paused, letting his words sink in, before moving closer to the group. "And when I examined the second crime scene, Miss Brixton's body, I found the final piece of the puzzle. Something small, something overlooked by everyone else." Poirot's eyes flickered over the guests, waiting for their reaction. "It was the vial of poison," he said, a slight edge to his voice. "I recognized the type of poison. It's rare, only a select few would have access to it. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their nervous energy palpable. The same poison used in Miss Brixton's death, Poirot continued. But here's the key. The vial wasn't just lying there in plain view. It was tucked away in a pocket, hidden in plain sight. Why would it be hidden? Why not simply leave it for the authorities to find? Someone wanted it to go unnoticed. Poirot's gaze hardened. That someone is still among us. One of you, sitting here, was connected to both deaths. The tension in the room reached its peak. Each guest shifted, some edging away slightly, others avoiding eye contact with Poirot. Lady Margaret Wilkins seemed to be holding her breath, her knuckles white as she clenched her hands together. Richard Devereux, whose previously collected demeanor had begun to unravel, clenched his jaw and avoided Poirot's eyes. Mrs. Hastings, too, seemed uneasy, her hands visibly shaking. Poirot's eyes settled on Lord Hartley, who had remained quiet for most of the evening, a nervous energy radiating from him. He appeared almost to calm, a veneer of composure that couldn't quite mask his anxiety. Poirot approached him, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Lord Hartley, I must ask you, what are you not telling me? Why are you so intent on avoiding the truth?" Hartley's eyes widened, and he recoiled slightly, his breath coming a little too quickly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of being caught. Poirot turned his attention back to the group. "This clue, the vial of poison, has brought us closer to the truth. But there is more. Someone here was close to both Sir Alistair and Miss Brixton. Someone who knew about the poison, knew its effects, and perhaps someone who wanted both of them silenced for good." The group was now visibly rattled. The mystery was no longer just a puzzle, it had become a dangerous game. And as Poirot looked at each of them, he knew that the moment of truth was nearing. "I will have the answers soon," Poirot said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "And when I do, I will expose the person who has been pulling the strings from the shadows." With that, Poirot left the room, his mind racing. The threads were finally coming together. Soon, very soon, the web of deception would be unraveled, and the killer would be revealed. But who among them was the murderer? And what had driven them to commit such a calculated crime? The answer was closer than ever, and Poirot was ready to uncover it. Chapter 11. Tensions riseth tension in the drawing room had reached its zenith. The suspects, now acutely aware of the weight of Poirot's words, shifted uneasily in their seats. The revelation of the rare poison and its connection to both Sir Alistair's and Miss Brixton's deaths had shaken them to their core. Poirot had already gathered the pieces of the puzzle, but it was clear to him that these pieces would not simply fall into place without further examination. It was time to tighten the pressure, to observe their reactions, and to see who would crack under the weight of their own guilt. Poirot paced the room slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, as the others sat in a tense silence. He could feel their eyes following him, studying his every movement. It was as though the walls themselves were pressing in on them. The grand chandelier above cast long shadows, its light flickering faintly, adding to the atmosphere of unease that filled the space. "I trust you all understand the gravity of the situation," Poirot began, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. "Two murders, and each one connected to this man, Sir Alistair Carrington. And now Miss Brixton, her death is not an isolated incident. She, too, was silenced. But why?" He turned his gaze on Lady Margaret Wilkins, who had been unusually quiet since the mention of the poisoned vial. She sat with her back straight, her fingers clasped tightly together in her lap, but there was a slight tremor in her hands that did not go unnoticed by Poirot. "Madam Wilkins," he said, addressing her with measured precision, "I have been thinking about your relationship with Sir Alistair. You said earlier that you had many differences, that you had parted ways long ago. But what I find intriguing is the timing of your separation." Why, after everything, did you distance yourself from him? Lady Margaret's eyes flickered, her expression briefly betraying a flash of something guilt. Perhaps, or fear. Sir Alistair's business dealings were complicated, she said, her voice faltering slightly. I couldn't stand by him any longer. He became ruthless, too consumed with power. I left because I wanted nothing to do with his world. Poirot's gaze did not waver as he absorbed her words. And what of Miss Brixton? He asked softly. Was she part of that world? Did she, too, fall victim to his complications? Lady Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Poirot watched her closely, his mind turning over the possibility that Lady Margaret knew more than she was letting on. There was something hidden beneath her calm exterior, something she was reluctant to reveal. Poirot moved on, his attention now shifting to Richard Devereux. The businessman, who had been pacing earlier, now stood near the window, his hands gripping the edge of the frame as if trying to steady himself. He had avoided direct eye contact with Poirot, and his body language suggested that he was grappling with something, perhaps fear, perhaps guilt. Mr. Devereux, Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence. I have noticed that you are somewhat agitated. Perhaps it is the weight of the investigation, or perhaps it is something else. Your reaction to Miss Brixton's death, to Sir Alistair's murder, what is it that is troubling you? Devereux's shoulders tensed, and he straightened, clearly caught off guard by Poirot's directness. I am not troubled, he replied quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. It is just difficult, this situation. I've known Sir Alistair for years, and Miss Brixton, well, she was never part of the inner circle. She was just a nuisance, a nuisance. Poirot repeated, his tone gentle but pointed. You speak of Miss Brixton as though she were insignificant, yet we know she was involved in something much larger than that. Did you know her well, Mr. Devereux? Did she pose a threat to you in some way? Devereux's eyes narrowed, but Poirot caught the fleeting hesitation. I didn't know her well, he said stiffly. She was a guest at Sir Alistair's estate. That's all. Poirot's mind raced as he processed Devereux's words. The businessman's response was too quick, too rehearsed. Poirot could sense the guarded nature of his reply, as if Devereux were trying to protect himself or someone else. The layers of deception were beginning to show, but Poirot needed more to connect the dots. He turned his attention now to Lord Edward Hartley, who had been watching the exchange in silence. Hartley seemed the least involved, the least eager to engage. Yet his earlier reaction, his nervousness, when the poison was mentioned, still lingered in Poirot's mind. Lord Hartley. Poirot addressed him, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of pressure. You were one of the first to arrive at the scene. You saw Sir Alistair's body, and then Miss Brixton's. You seem detached, as though you are more of an observer than a participant in all this. Hartley shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the floor. I didn't see anything unusual, he muttered. I don't know anything about the deaths. I'm not involved. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on him. No one is claiming you are involved, Lord Hartley, Poirot said slowly. But I cannot help but wonder, what is it that you know? What are you hiding? Hartley recoiled slightly, his body stiffening as though he had been struck. I don't know what you mean, Poirot, he stammered, his voice trembling. Poirot's eyes softened, but there was no mistaking the underlying intensity. I believe you, Lord Hartley, Poirot said, his voice quiet. But I also believe you are hiding something, and it is only a matter of time before you reveal it. The room grew still once again, the only sound the distant ticking of a clock on the wall. Each suspect was now under Poirot's scrutiny, and it was clear that the walls were closing in. The tension was mounting, and Poirot could feel the truth drawing nearer. The truth is within our grasp, Poirot said softly, almost to himself, and it will soon be revealed. But one of you must speak first, and when you do, the game will be over. The silence in the room was suffocating, but Poirot's words had cut through it like a knife. It was only a matter of time before the culprit's secrets would unravel, and Poirot would be there to expose them all. Chapter 12. The confrontation room was stifling now, the air thick with unspoken words and suspicion. Poirot stood at the center, watching the suspects with a calm that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy radiating from them. He could feel their tension, their unease. The walls of their deception were beginning to crack, and soon someone would break. The only question was who. Lady Margaret Wilkins had not said a word since Poirot had pressed her earlier. She sat with her arms tightly crossed, her eyes fixed on the floor. Richard Devereux had been fidgeting nervously since the mention of the letter and the rare poison. He seemed to be calculating his next move, as though trying to stay one step ahead of Poirot's deductions. Mrs. Hastings, ever the nervous participant, was tapping her fingers incessantly on the armrest. Her lips slightly parted as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Poirot's sharp gaze flickered over to Lord Hartley, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the last round of questioning. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, but there was a nervous energy in his posture that suggested he was struggling to contain something. Poirot's mind raced as he considered all the possibilities. And then, finally, it happened. Lady Margaret broke the silence. "You're wrong, Poirot," she said, her voice thin but determined. "You don't know the whole story. You have no idea what we've all been through." Poirot's gaze flickered to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Ah, Madam Wilkins, what is it that you are trying to say? What is it that you think I don't know?" Her hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, Poirot saw a flash of anger in her eyes. "You don't understand the weight of Sir Alistair's dealings, or the danger we were all in," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He had enemies, people who would stop at nothing to ruin him. And Miss Brixton, she was tangled in it all. She knew too much." Poirot took a step closer to her, his expression softening. "You mean to say, madam, that Miss Brixton's death was not random? That she was not just an innocent bystander in all of this?" Lady Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "She wasn't innocent," she said firmly. "She knew about Sir Alistair's business dealings. She was trying to blackmail him." The words hit the room like a bolt of lightning. The other suspects glanced around at each other, clearly taken aback by Lady Margaret's confession. Poirot, however, remained calm, his mind already processing the new information. And what? Madam Wilkins, did she know about these dealings? What could she possibly have uncovered that was so dangerous? Lady Margaret hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sir Alistair was involved in some very shady deals. He had connections with people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Miss Brixton, she had evidence letters, documents. She had everything she needed to ruin him." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "And you, Madam Wilkins, were involved in these dealings as well? Was this the reason for your strained relationship with Sir Alistair?" Lady Margaret's face darkened. "I had no choice. He threatened me. He threatened to ruin everything I had. But I never wanted to be a part of it. I tried to distance myself from him, but it wasn't that simple." Poirot stepped back, allowing the silence to fill the room for a moment. He could see the raw emotion in Lady Margaret's eyes, the fear, the guilt, and the uncertainty. She had been entangled in something far darker than she had admitted, and now the truth was slowly slipping out. "Mr. Devereux," Poirot said, turning his attention to the businessman, "you were Sir Alistair's partner. What role did you play in all of this? Were you aware of Miss Brixton's knowledge?" Devereux's eyes darted to Lady Margaret, then quickly back to Poirot. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it quickly, as though unsure of how to proceed. I didn't know about the blackmail," he said, his voice tight. "But I knew Sir Alistair had enemies. He wasn't exactly the most well-liked man." It's possible Miss Brixton had something on him. Poirot regarded him silently for a moment, noting the strain in his voice. He was lying, but Poirot needed more than this to make an accusation. And Miss Brixton's death, do you believe it was related to her involvement in these dealings? Devereux shifted uncomfortably, his face betraying the uncertainty that had been building in him for some time. Yes, I believe it was. She had something on Sir Alistair, something important, but I didn't think anyone would actually kill her over it. Poirot's gaze sharpened. But someone did, Mr. Devereux, someone did. He turned toward the others, his eyes scanning each of them one by one. They were all caught in this web of lies, each of them holding pieces of the truth but unwilling to share the whole picture. Poirot could feel the tension in the room building. The confrontation was approaching its peak, and soon the pieces would fall into place. Poirot allowed the silence to linger for a moment, his mind working furiously as he pieced together the details. Miss Brixton's death was not random, he said quietly. It was carefully planned, and Sir Alistair's murder was the same. There's a connection between these two deaths, something that ties them together. But the question remains, who among you wanted them both silenced? No one spoke. The room was frozen, each suspect now acutely aware of the weight of Poirot's words. He could feel the shift in the air. The game was now at its most dangerous, and Poirot knew that the truth would soon be revealed. All of you are hiding something, Poirot said softly, but not for long. The confrontation was far from over. But Poirot was closer than ever to the truth, and soon the killer would be unmasked. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Tension in the drawing room had reached a breaking point. Each suspect sat in a mixture of unease and anticipation, their nerves taut, their faces betraying their internal turmoil. Poirot had made his move, and now the game was nearing its climax. Every word he spoke seemed to chip away at their carefully constructed facades, revealing cracks in their stories and a growing desperation to keep their secrets buried. But the detective could sense that the truth was almost within his grasp. As Poirot paced the room, his sharp eyes lingered on each suspect, reading the subtle cues that betrayed their inner thoughts. Lord Hartley, though composed on the outside, still wore an expression of distress. Lady Margaret Wilkins, who had been forced to confront her past, seemed on the edge of something: guilt, fear, or perhaps both. Devereux stood stiffly, his nervous energy now replaced by a carefully cultivated indifference. But Poirot knew better. And then there was Mrs. Hastings, who appeared to be on the verge of breaking down, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Poirot paused in front of the fireplace, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. For a brief moment, he needed to keep pressing, to force them into revealing the final pieces of the puzzle. But something was nagging at him, a faint feeling that someone here might try to run. It was a subtle instinct, but Poirot trusted it. There was always one who, when cornered, would try to escape. And then, as if on cue, Lord Hartley stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sudden motion caught everyone's attention. I can't take this anymore," Hartley exclaimed, his voice strained with panic. "I didn't kill anyone. I didn't know about the poison, about the blackmail. You're all just twisting the truth to make it fit your theory. I'm innocent." His voice cracked with the final words, and his eyes darted toward the door. Poirot's instincts flared as he watched the young man make a sudden move toward the exit. The tension in the room deepened as Hartley took a few steps forward, his chest heaving with anxiety. Before anyone could react, Poirot's voice rang out, calm and firm. "Lord Hartley, do not attempt to leave." Hartley froze in his tracks, his body tense. For a moment, no one spoke, and the silence seemed to stretch on interminably. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on Hartley, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. There was a moment of hesitation, but then, as if forced by an unseen hand. Hartley slowly turned back to face Poirot. I just want to leave. I want to get away from all of this," Hartley stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to be trapped like this." Poirot regarded him with a mixture of empathy and quiet authority. "I understand, Lord Hartley. You are trapped, yes, but escaping will not help you. The truth will come to light, whether you run or stay." Hartley's hands trembled, and he took an unsteady step back, as though trying to distance himself from Poirot's unflinching gaze. "I didn't kill her, I swear," he cried out, his voice rising with panic. "I didn't poison anyone. I didn't want any of this to happen. I just wanted it all to stop." Poirot slowly approached, his voice low and soothing. "I know you didn't kill Miss Brixton, Lord Hartley, but you know more than you're letting on. You are connected to this case in ways that you have not yet revealed, and that is why you are frightened." Hartley's eyes widened, and he stepped back again, his mouth opening and closing as if he were searching for the right words. You didn't do that, Lord Hartley," Poirot interrupted, his tone unyielding. "You didn't want to be involved. You didn't want to get caught up in the mess that your father and Sir Alistair created. The truth, Lord Hartley, is that you are not just a bystander in this story. You are part of it." Hartley's face twisted with confusion and fear. "No, I didn't know. I didn't know anything about the business deals, the blackmail. I didn't know what Sir Alistair had gotten himself into. I didn't even know Miss Brixton was involved." Poirot stood still for a moment, watching Hartley's reactions. The young man's words didn't entirely match his body language. There was too much tension in his movements, too much fear in his eyes. Poirot could tell that he was hiding something, but what? "Lord Hartley," Poirot said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "you are lying. You were involved in Sir Alistair's affairs. You knew about Miss Brixton's presence in the story. And perhaps, just perhaps, you are afraid of what will happen when the full truth comes out." Hartley's face turned pale, and he looked like he might collapse from the weight of Poirot's words. For a moment, there was no sound in the room except for the crackling of the fire. Then, with a shaky breath, Hartley seemed to deflate, his posture slumping as the adrenaline seemed to drain from him. "I didn't kill anyone," he muttered again, but this time, there was no conviction in his voice. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Poirot took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Hartley's. "I know, Lord Hartley, but the truth will come to light, and it is time to stop running." There was a long pause. Poirot knew that Hartley was on the edge of breaking just one more push, one more piece of the puzzle, and the truth would come crashing down. But for now, Poirot had one thing in mind. "Let us continue." "Lord Hartley," Poirot said quietly, "and perhaps you will find the strength to tell me everything you know." The young man stood still, his chest heaving with each breath. The air in the room was thick with unresolved tension, and Poirot could feel that the moment of truth was fast approaching. There was only one thing left to do: push them further until the walls collapsed completely. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into Placide's room was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Poirot stood at the center, his eyes flicking between the suspects, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. The confrontation with Lord Hartley had left the group on edge. The young man had cracked, but not entirely. There was more to be uncovered, and Poirot knew that the final piece of the puzzle was within his reach. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and the key to unlocking the mystery lay with the people before him: Lady Margaret Wilkins, Richard Devereux, Mrs. Hastings. Each of them had been so careful with their words, their actions a mix of calculated responses and subtle slips of the tongue. But Poirot had seen through their facades. He knew now that their secrets could no longer be contained. Poirot turned his attention back to Lord Hartley, who was still trembling at the edges of the room. his posture stiff, his eyes darting nervously. The young man had almost been on the verge of breaking, and Poirot could feel that the walls were coming down, piece by piece. But there was something more to discover, something that would expose the final lie that connected them all. "Lord Hartley," Poirot said, his voice steady but piercing, "I believe you know more than you've let on. You are connected to Miss Brixton's death in a way you have not yet admitted." Hartley flinched at the words, his hands clenched tightly by his sides. He was silent, but his eyes betrayed the growing realization that Poirot was drawing ever closer to the truth. The others were watching, too, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Poirot moved closer, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You were involved, weren't you? You didn't want Sir Alistair to be exposed, and you certainly didn't want Miss Brixton to reveal what she knew. You knew that if her information reached the wrong hands, everything would unravel. You knew she had to be silenced." Lord Hartley swallowed hard, the sweat gathering on his forehead. He tried to speak but couldn't find the words. His lips parted but no sound came out. Poirot gave him a moment, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "It was you who killed Miss Brixton, wasn't it, Lord Hartley? It wasn't out of malice, but fear. You killed her to protect yourself and the secrets you were trying to keep buried." The room was so quiet that Poirot could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the distance. The silence was deafening, each breath in the room laden with anticipation. Poirot's gaze never wavered. He knew he was right. Hartley's hands shook as he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to," he trailed off, his words faltering. I never wanted to be caught in all of this. My father's debts, Sir Alistair's dealings, it was all too much. I didn't know what else to do." Poirot's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "You were too caught up in the world Sir Alistair created, and when you realized Miss Brixton had the power to expose it, you acted out of desperation." Hartley nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "Yes, she knew too much. She was going to ruin everything. I didn't know how to stop her, and then I panicked. I didn't mean to poison her. It was supposed to be a warning, just a way to scare her. But it went too far." Poirot took a step back, his mind processing the revelation. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such desperation, but it still held a certain gravity. Lord Hartley had killed Miss Brixton not out of cold calculation, but out of fear of losing everything, fear of exposure. "And Sir Alistair?" Poirot asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of curiosity. "How did he fit into all of this? Did you kill him as well? Was that part of the plan?" Hartley's eyes shot up at the accusation, his face contorting in shock. "No, I didn't kill Sir Alistair. He stopped, his voice faltering as he caught sight of Poirot's gaze. "I don't know how it happened. I didn't do it. I didn't kill him." Poirot was quiet for a long moment, studying Hartley's face, searching for any sign of deception. "Tell me everything, Lord Hartley. How did you know about Miss Brixton's death? How did you know what happened to Sir Alistair?" Hartley's shoulders slumped, and for a brief moment, the weight he had tried so hard to maintain shattered. His eyes were filled with something close to despair. "I didn't do it," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But I was there. I saw the body." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his mind whirring as he pieced together the fragments of Hartley's confession. "You were there, you say, but you didn't kill him. Who then, Lord Hartley?" Hartley closed his eyes tightly, as though trying to block out the images in his mind. "I was with him the night he died. We had an argument, a fight. He was angry, I was angry. But I didn't kill him, I swear. Someone else did." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Someone else, you say? And who might that be, Lord Hartley?" Hartley hesitated, his face contorting with inner conflict. The truth was teetering on the edge, and Poirot could almost see it. It was a matter of time before the full story came spilling out, But before Hartley could speak, there was a sudden interruption, the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the door. A constable entered the room, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir Poirot," the constable gasped, breathless. "We've found something else, something more disturbing." Poirot turned to face the constable, his mind already racing. "What is it?" The constable looked around the room, his eyes wide with alarm. "A letter, sir. It was found hidden in the study, and it implicates someone else entirely." The room went silent again, and Poirot felt his pulse quicken. The pieces were falling into place, but now, with this new development, the mystery has grown even more complex. The final truth, it seemed, was just beyond his reach. "Show me," Poirot said, his voice quiet but commanding. "We are closer than ever, but this could change everything." Chapter 15. The final gathering room was quiet again, but the tension was now more palpable than ever. The constable had exited with a sense of urgency, leaving Poirot standing in the center of the drawing room, his mind racing. The last few hours had been a whirlwind, layers of deception, veiled threats, and now, a new revelation that threatened to change everything. The letter the constable had mentioned, the one that could implicate someone else entirely, held the key. But who was behind it? And what did it mean for the case? Poirot turned to the remaining guests, his sharp gaze cutting through the thick silence. They were all on edge, each suspect now acutely aware that the detective was drawing ever closer to the truth. They shifted in their seats, each of them trying to mask their unease. But Poirot could see it, the subtle shifts in their posture, the nervous glances, the tightening of jaws. They knew they were on the verge of being exposed, and they were waiting for Poirot to make his next move. "I must thank you all for your patience," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the air. "The investigation has taken an unexpected turn, as I'm sure you've all noticed, but the final pieces of the puzzle are now before us. We are very close to the truth." Lady Margaret Wilkins was the first to speak, her voice trembling with something between fear and anticipation. "What do you mean, Poirot? Are you saying you know who did it?" Poirot regarded her silently for a moment, his mind sifting through the information he had gathered. She had been the one to crack, first admitting the blackmail, her involvement in Sir Alistair's affairs. But was she guilty, or was she simply another pawn in a larger game? "I believe I know who is behind Sir Alistair's death," Poirot said, his voice cool and deliberate. "And Miss Brixton's, for that matter. But I will not say until I have all the facts. You see, there is still one last mystery to solve." The others looked at one another, their eyes wide with growing dread. No one spoke. They were all waiting for Poirot to reveal what he knew. But Poirot remained silent, his gaze flickering from one suspect to the next. Then, as if on cue, the constable returned, his expression tense. He held a small, sealed envelope in his hand, one that seemed to carry the weight of the room itself. "Sir Poirot," the constable said, his voice trembling slightly, "this is the letter we found. It was hidden in Sir Alistair's study, and it implicates one of the guests." Poirot stepped forward, his eyes scanning the letter as the constable handed it to him. He carefully broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, elegant strokes that seemed almost to practice. Poirot's eyes flicked over the contents, his mind working to absorb each word. "What does it say?" "Poirot," Mrs. Hastings asked nervously, her eyes darting between the detective and the letter. Poirot held up a hand, signaling for silence. He was reading, his expression neutral, but his mind moving quickly. The letter was short but revealing. It spoke of secret meetings, hidden motives, and a promise made to silence someone who had uncovered too much about Sir Alistair's dealings. But the most telling part was the signature, clear, unmistakable, and tied directly to one of the people in the room. Poirot's gaze flicked from the letter to Lady Margaret Wilkins. She was watching him closely, her face pale, her hands now clasped tightly in her lap. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by something else, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Poirot felt the pieces click into place, but he needed one final push to expose everything. "Lady Wilkins," Poirot said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. "It seems you were not as uninvolved as you claimed. This letter, found in Sir Alistair's study, implicates you." The room fell silent at Poirot's words, the shock rippling through the gathered suspects. Lady Margaret's eyes widened, and she sat up straighter, her face flushed with a mix of surprise and something darker, defensiveness. "Perhaps, Poirot," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving her. "You see, madam, this letter was written by someone who was very close to Sir Alistair, someone who knew his secrets and who had everything to lose, someone who would do anything to protect themselves, no matter the cost." Lady Margaret swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she finally spoke. Yes, I wrote it. But I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't want any of this to happen. Sir Alistair, he had my father's debt over my head. He threatened to ruin me." Poirot nodded slowly, understanding now the complexity of her motives. She had been desperate, cornered by Sir Alistair's threats. But desperation alone didn't explain murder. It was something darker, something deeper. "And Miss Brixton?" Poirot asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "What about her? Why did you kill her?" Lady Margaret closed her eyes, tears welling up as she finally confessed. "She found out. She had a copy of the letter, the one I wrote to Sir Alistair. She threatened to tell everyone. I couldn't let her." Poirot's heart sank as he listened to her words. The confession was complete now, and the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Lady Margaret Wilkins, in her desperation, had killed to protect herself and the secret she had long kept buried. She had been tangled in Sir Alistair's world of corruption, blackmail, and deceit, and when Miss Brixton had come too close to the truth, Lady Margaret had done the unthinkable. The room was silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. Poirot looked at the others, his mind still racing. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were only beginning. "Lady Wilkins," Poirot said softly, "you have confessed to 2 murders, and yet the justice you sought has only led to your downfall." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I never meant for it to end like this," she whispered. Poirot took one last look around the room. The game was over. The truth had come to light, and justice would be served. Now, "We must let the authorities do their part," Poirot said, his voice firm, "and this case will be closed." The final chapter was written, and the mystery was solved. But Poirot knew this was just another story in a long line of dark secrets that would never truly fade from memory. Chapter 16. The reveal room was still, the weight of Poirot's revelation hanging in the air. The truth was out. Lady Margaret Wilkins had confessed to the murders of Sir Alistair Carrington and Miss Brixton. Yet, as the guests remained silent, something about the situation felt incomplete. Poirot, though calm on the surface, could feel that there was more beneath the surface, a final piece that had yet to fall into place. Lady Margaret sat rigidly, her face flushed with shame, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had confessed, but Poirot could see the conflict within her. The weight of her actions, the guilt, was palpable, but there was still a certain relief in the air, the relief that came with unburdening herself of the secret. But the story, as Poirot knew, wasn't quite finished yet. "Lady Wilkins," Poirot said softly, his voice breaking the tense silence, "you have confessed to the deaths of both Sir Alistair and Miss Brixton. But tell me, why did you think you could escape the consequences?" Lady Margaret's eyes met his, a flash of something, perhaps defiance, flashing in them for a brief moment, before she dropped her gaze again. I didn't think I could escape, she replied, her voice quiet. I thought it would be over, that I could move on from this life. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her. But you didn't. You acted out of fear, didn't you? You feared exposure, feared being ruined by Sir Alistair's dealings and Miss Brixton's knowledge. Lady Margaret nodded, her fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. Yes, she whispered. I couldn't let her ruin me. She had everything, the letters, the proof. She could have destroyed everything. And Sir Alistair, he would have let it happen. He wouldn't have helped me. Poirot's mind raced, piecing the fragments of her confession together. But you didn't stop there, did you, madam? You took matters into your own hands, thinking that Miss Brixton's silence would protect you. Yet, in doing so, you've sealed your fate. Lady Margaret looked up at him, her face pale. I never meant for it to go this far. I didn't mean to kill her. But when I saw the letter, when I saw what she was planning to do, I just lost control. I thought if I could scare her, threaten her, make her understand. But then it was too late. Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. And Sir Alistair? You had no qualms about his death? Was that an afterthought? Lady Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She seemed to struggle with her emotions. Sir Alistair, he wasn't the man he used to be. He was ruthless. He would have ruined me, too, if I hadn't acted. When I saw what he was capable of, I knew it had to end. Poirot watched her, his mind processing the pieces of the puzzle that had now been revealed. The motive had been fear of exposure, and the desire to protect herself. But there was more to it, something deeper, something that had driven Lady Margaret to her breaking point. Poirot's eyes moved to Richard Devereux, who had remained largely silent since Lady Margaret's confession. The businessman had been a key figure in Sir Alistair's world, complicit in the schemes and the darkness that had tainted their dealings. Mr. Devereux, Poirot said, his voice cutting through the room. You knew of Sir Alistair's affairs, did you not? You were complicit in his world. You knew about the debts, the threats. You had to know about Miss Brixton's knowledge. Devereux shifted uncomfortably, his face tightening. I had nothing to do with her death, Poirot. I didn't kill her. Perhaps not, Poirot agreed, his voice calm. But you knew something. You must have. After all, you were so close to Sir Alistair. You worked with him on his business. You knew how desperate things were getting, didn't you? Devereux's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw a flash of guilt, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't want anyone to die, he muttered, his voice low. But I wasn't involved in any of this mess. I didn't want to be. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But you stayed silent. You allowed it all to happen, didn't you? You allowed Sir Alistair's actions to continue unchecked. And when Miss Brixton threatened to expose him, you did nothing. You let the storm brew, knowing that someone would eventually be caught in the middle. Devereux clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. I didn't think it would end like this, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I didn't think anyone would actually kill her. Poirot turned away from him, his thoughts moving to Mrs. Hastings. The woman had seemed too eager to play the part of the innocent bystander, but Poirot had seen the cracks in her performance. Her involvement in this story was deeper than she had let on. Mrs. Hastings, Poirot said, his voice now calm but piercing. You were the one who raised the alarm when Sir Alistair's body was discovered. But what did you know, madam? What did you see? Mrs. Hastings flinched, her eyes widening in fear as Poirot's gaze settled on her. I didn't know anything, Poirot. I found him. I found Sir Alistair's body. Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. You knew more than you admit, Mrs. Hastings. You knew about the secrets. You knew about Miss Brixton's involvement. Why didn't you speak sooner? The room fell silent again as Poirot's words reverberated through the space. The truth was laid bare, but there were still pieces of the puzzle to uncover. As the silence stretched on, Poirot knew the final confession was still to come. The key to unlocking everything lay just out of reach. But soon, the entire story would be told. "I have the answers I need," Poirot said softly, almost to himself. "But the final truth must be heard. And soon, very soon, it will be." Chapter 17, Outcome, and Justice's room was still, the weight of Poirot's revelation hanging in the air. Lady Margaret Wilkins had confessed, but there was still a lingering tension. The truth had been exposed, yet the consequences of her actions had yet to unfold. Poirot stood calmly, his gaze moving between the remaining suspects, noting their reactions as they processed the confession. Lady Margaret sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression one of both relief and despair. She had admitted to killing Miss Brixton, to silencing her out of fear of exposure. But Sir Alistair's murder was not so easily explained. Poirot knew that the true nature of her actions went deeper than she had let on. Lady Margaret finally spoke, her voice shaky. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix things before they got out of control. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But Miss Brixton, she was going to ruin everything." Poirot nodded slowly. "You acted out of fear, madam, but that fear clouded your judgment. You thought you could keep the truth hidden, but you failed to see that the truth always finds its way out." Lady Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to kill her. I didn't want any of this." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. Unable to face Poirot any longer, Poirot's gaze moved to the others, his mind still piecing together the remaining fragments. "You are not alone in this, madam. The others in this room have been complicit, even if they didn't take part in the murders. Your actions are not isolated. The connections are clear." Richard Devereux shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by the shift in attention. He had remained quiet for most of the conversation, but now the weight of Poirot's gaze was upon him. "I didn't kill anyone," he said quickly, his voice tight. "I didn't want any of this. I just what?" Poirot interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "You were part of Sir Alistair's world, Mr. Devereux. You knew what he was capable of. You knew about Miss Brixton's involvement. And yet you did nothing." Devereux's expression faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, unsure of how to defend himself. Finally, he sighed. "I didn't want to get involved. I thought it would all blow over. I didn't think anyone would get hurt." Poirot turned toward Mrs. Hastings, who had been unusually silent since Lady Margaret's confession. Her hands trembled as she clasped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "And you, Mrs. Hastings, you raised the alarm when Sir Alistair's body was discovered. But I suspect you knew more than you've let on." Double quotes. Mrs. Hastings' eyes widened, and she took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. I didn't kill anyone," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to be part of this. I didn't know it would go this far." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I believe you, Mrs. Hastings, but you knew, didn't you? You knew something about Sir Alistair's dealings, about Miss Brixton. You were aware of the danger, yet you didn't speak up." Her eyes welled with tears. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get caught up in all of this." Poirot nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "Fear makes us do terrible things, but in the end, it doesn't excuse our actions." The final silence hung heavily in the room as Poirot turned back to Lady Margaret. "Justice will be served, madam. You have confessed, and now the authorities will take over." Lady Margaret nodded, her face drawn with remorse. The weight of her actions hung heavily in the air, but it was clear she was ready to face the consequences. Poirot took a step back, his mind already shifting to the next task. The case had been solved, the truth revealed. The final chapter of this dark story had been written. Now it was time for justice to be done. "The mystery is over," Poirot said softly. The truth has been uncovered. And now, the law will do its part. With those final words, the room fell into silence once more. The burden of guilt and truth finally laid bare. The game was over. Chapter 18. The closing remarked finality of the moment settled over the room like a heavy, impenetrable fog. The truth had been laid bare, and the pieces of the puzzle that had once seemed so elusive now fit perfectly together. Lady Margaret Wilkins had confessed, and the others, though complicit, had been exposed for their roles in this tangled web of deceit. Now, all that remained was the quiet aftermath, the calm that followed a storm of revelations. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the faces before him, each person marked by the weight of their actions. The confessions had been painful, raw, but they were the necessary conclusion to a long, difficult investigation. His mind was still processing the details, the hidden motives, the lies, the desperation that had driven each of them to their breaking points. Yet, despite the darkness of it all, Poirot felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice, though delayed, had been served. Lady Margaret Wilkins sat in silence, her head bowed in defeat. Her face, once filled with the arrogance of someone who believed they could outsmart the world, now bore the weariness of a woman who had lost everything. The truth had consumed her, and now there was nothing left but the consequences. Poirot turned his gaze to her, his voice soft but unwavering. "Madam Wilkins, you have confessed to the deaths of both Sir Alistair and Miss Brixton. You acted out of fear, and in the end, your fear led you to make choices that will cost you dearly. But you were not the only one who feared. The others in this room feared. Too, some of them more than you will ever understand." Lady Margaret's eyes lifted slowly, and for a brief moment, they met Poirot's. There was a flicker of recognition in them, a sense of finality. "I never thought it would end like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It rarely does, madam. But that is the nature of fear, is it not? It blinds us to the consequences of our actions until it is too late." He turned away from her, his attention shifting to the others in the room. "You, Mr. Devereux, Mrs. Hastings, Lord Hartley, each of you played a part in this tragedy. Some of you were willing to let things unfold, to turn a blind eye, while others of you acted out of your own desperation. But in the end, you are all responsible." Devereux flinched at the words, his gaze faltering as he met Poirot's eyes. Mrs. Hastings looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though the weight of her guilt had finally become too much to bear. Lord Hartley, pale and exhausted, said nothing, but his eyes betrayed the internal struggle that had taken root in him long ago. Poirot's gaze softened as he looked at them. "It is easy to hide behind fear, to allow it to control us, to make decisions that seem right in the moment, but lead us down a dark path. But the truth, no matter how hard we try to avoid it, always catches up with us." There was a long silence as the words settled in the room. Poirot could see the conflict in the others, the guilt, the regret, and perhaps even a sense of relief that the burden of their secrets had been lifted. Poirot's eyes turned to the door, where the constables were waiting, their expressions neutral. It was time for the authorities to step in, to take over the investigation from this point forward. Poirot had done his part. The truth had been exposed, and now the consequences would unfold in the hands of the law, justice. Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his final thoughts, "has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how much we try to bury it. It may be delayed, but it is inevitable. And in the end, that is all we can hope for, justice." As the constables entered the room to take charge, Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Lady Margaret. "You will face the consequences of your actions, madam. And in time, perhaps you will come to understand that no matter how far we run, we cannot escape the truth." With that, Poirot turned and made his way toward the door, his every step measured, his mind already turning to the next case, the next challenge. He had solved this one. The truth had been uncovered, and justice would follow. The game was over.